Okay, so let's talk a little bit about value. Value in color theory refers to relative lightness and darkness of a color. This color, it's the same paint, has a darker value, much darker than this one over here, and then it has some values in between the two. And this is called a gradient, when you have a gradient of light to dark color. So we can do that also with this blue color here, using what's called a glazing technique, or layering. This is when you paint down the first layer here and it is completely dry, and then you go over with either the same color or another color and make another layer that will then dry on top of it. And then you're going to let that dry. Let's see what happens with it. Pause that. While it's drying, let's go ahead and try mixing light to dark values of this color. Let's start with the really light value. I've got a little blue left on the brush still, but I'm gonna trying to clean it off a little bit. I might need a little more actually. It's gonna be pretty light. Alright. It's got a little green in it, but that's okay. That's the first value. And then we're going to get a really saturated with the color. You see this little bit of the paint that's right there? We're just going to try to get as much of that onto the brush as possible and make another square. It's going to be the darkest value one. And then we want to do one that's somewhere in between the two values. So I'm just going to dip into this well here. That's kind of a good in between. And it depends how much paint is on here too. Dry. Since it's on a slanted surface, I'm just going to let it move that way a bit. And then we fill in the gradients of everything in between here. So I'm going to add more water to focus on this gradient side here. You can kind of tap off when there's too much paint by kind of doing that. A little more water if it's starting to seem too saturated. It's too green for some reason. And it's kind of a little tricky thing to do. It's a little harder than it seems, so don't get discouraged. Sometimes you have to add just a little more paint and just get comfortable with that. And I'm going to do the other side of this where it's getting darker. Just add a little more. We'll see how it dries then, and we can kind of see what the gradient will be like then. I'm just going to lift it up a bit so the paint can kind of spread a little more evenly. It's not the most even gradient. Let's see. I need to add a little more to this one here. Just clean that off. I'm going to try to lift it. If I make this brush really dry, I can kind of absorb some of that paint, as you can see. Well, that's kind of rough value scale. Another way you can do it is by building up layers or glazing. You have the first layer that's completely dry, and this is a very light one, and you can add another thin layer on top and then let it dry. I'm going to do that for a few of these here. You see this one is a second layer that's drying too. This is referred to as the glazing technique. I'm actually going to lift it, we don't need that much. that's drying, I'm going to show you what it's like to glaze with another color then. We are going to add some quinacridone magenta to this well here. I'm just going to squeeze it out. Get some water in there, add a little bit, and it's going to fan out a little bit now. Mix that to see what color I want. And let's go over now this dry blue here, the layer. And look, you can kind of see what the difference is when it's glazed over this and over the paint here. This would look like if you just put it straight onto the paper. This is what it looks like when it goes on top of a second color there. So that's kind of cool. Let's clean off the brush here. Let's clean off the pigment, that pink. And let's go back to the blue here, which is nearly dry, and add another layer to this next gradient. And this way you can keep building up different layers. And that's kind of one of the big principles of watercolor, that you work from light to dark. Versus with oil painting, you would work dark to light. You would start with a darker value color. Then if you want to make details like snow on top of it, you would then add the white paint and dab it on top. In this case with watercolor, that watercolor white paint is so transparent, because that's the whole beauty of watercolor, it's transparent, that you're not going to put white watercolor paint on top to add little snowflakes. It's going to barely show up, it's going to dry very lightly. Watercolor dries lighter. So instead what you do is you save those little areas here of the white for the snowflake, and then you'll paint around it. So when you first start painting a subject, identify if there are going to be any really light white areas that you want to save, because the paper is going to show it. Anyway, back to this here. I'm going to keep add a lot more paint onto that brush. That's going to be a heavier load of paint in that layer there. I'm just going to spread it out here. Just kind of experiment a little bit. And while that's drying, let's do a layer of blue on top of here. And you can see the difference in value when it's the first layer versus the second layer of paint. And so that's kind of the principle. You'll be seeing that when we're doing the different watercolor exercises, that I'll be letting things dry and adding more paint to it, or I'll let it almost dry and, add a little more paint to it. So I'll either be doing wet on wet or wet on dry, or something in between to build up different layers. I'll start light and then I'll add more, identifying where the areas of high contrast will be, slowly building up the layers. So we'll see this more in practice later on.